Now, good evening all. Now we will start our tutorial 3 by Professor Paolo Missier from University of Newcastle, UK in online mode. The session chair of this session is Professor Samistha Niyogi from Jadavpur University, Kolkata. Professor Samistha Niyogi received her bachelor's and master's degree in computer science and engineering and also her PhD in engineering from Jadavpur University. She is currently a professor with the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Jadavpur University. She has several publications, including books to her credit. Her research interests include fault tolerance in distributed systems, reliability and security in wireless and mobile systems, and healthcare data analytics. Dr. Niyogi is a senior member of the IEEE Computer Society. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Mr. Niyogi to introduce our tutorial 3 by Professor Paolo Missier. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, and a very warm welcome to all of you in the post-tea session and the last session of today. So I also take this opportunity to thank the COMSYS organizers for giving me this opportunity and the pleasure to introduce the tutorial speaker, Professor Paolo Missier, to all of you. Paolo is Professor of Scalable Data Analytics with the School of Computing at Newcastle University and currently a Fellow 2018 to 2020 of the Alan Turing Institute, UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. Paolo's work has been funded over the years by EPSRC, NIHR BRC, Newton Fund UK, Microsoft Azure Research, and the Turing Institute. Funded projects included Cloud e-Genome on scalable processing of genomics pipeline on the cloud, Recomp on optimizing analytics pipelines in response to changes in data, P4 at NU towards personalized, participatory, preventive, precision medicine, and more. His more recent research portfolio addresses the challenges and opportunities of applied data science and machine learning for health, with contributions on the search for digital markers from self-monitoring devices, and recent work on predicting respiratory crisis in acute COVID patients. So we are all welcoming Professor Missier to deliver his tutorial on delivering on the promise of data-driven healthcare, challenges and research perspectives on generating robust and actionable clinical insights from big and small healthcare datasets. So over to Professor Missier, sir.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'm actually sorry that I cannot be with you in person. I guess it wasn't meant to be, so we'll do the most of the opportunity that this presentation. So by the way, my connection is not super stable. Please bear with me if it disappears for a second. It tends to come back, so it should be all right. So what I would like to talk about is data-driven healthcare, which is an area of research that I got into quite recently with a number of clinical colleagues at Newcastle and around the world, in fact. And quickly discovered that this is a really tough, challenging area from someone who comes from a database and a data management system like myself. Do the data engineering right, then everything else will just fall apart. I'll try to give some of this perspective. And I decided to keep this very high level. I have quite a few references for each of these sections, so I'm happy to leave okay, so this is an outline of what I'd like to talk about. Essentially, we are at the stage where AI for healthcare is coming of age, and that's because of a convergence of the needs from the clinical community, clinical research communities, and opportunities from that come from technology, and it's a combination of technology, computing power, and data availability that was not there until a few years ago. However, this actually gives rise to a really complex landscape, multifaceted, and I'll try to do justice to this landscape. And again, I'm going to cover quite a lot of ground. Perhaps you'll find it shallow, maybe, but maybe with indications of where the challenges are. As I said, the key for me is data engineering. There's essentially a mismatch solve our problems relative to the state of the data that is needed to fulfill those promises. And so this mismatch actually leads to barriers to AI adoption in this field. I'll try to give some examples with specific reference to electronic health records, EHRs, which is really the type of data that I'm mostly familiar with and work with. So to get started, I'm going to pick up on a definition that was also echoed in the introduction we use in one of our projects of P4 medicine, which was introduced around the year 2000, in fact, by Leroy Wood, who is a system biologist in the States, who said, look, the future of medicine is predictive, preventative, personalized, and participatory, which really means that if you put together technology with domain know-how and enough data about every one of us, essentially, then you should be able to address the problem of the burden of chronic diseases specifically. And this is of great interest to me personally, because the work that we funded to do now is essentially to do with managing multiple long-term conditions or multimorbidities, which is an emerging problem in much of the they say the world that is aging. Okay, so. Those with you. Please interrupt if you think the internet is not stable enough. Okay, so this P4 medicine really anticipates that, or sits on 5 pillars, and that and so in such a way that we can gain a holistic view of with lots of data that express who you are in a very complete way, and this data interacts in very complex ways. There's pointers to all sorts of data types for cardiovascular, so basically blood testing that gives you it gives you insight into diabetes risk, for example, inflammation states, stress levels, and then you can measure cardiovascular health, then your genetics, your proteomics, and emerging all of this data really constitutes a cloud that describes our, and it ranges on a spectrum, right? So it goes from genetic things that don't change to your phenotypes, medical history, demographics, all the way to your social behavior and the environment where you live. Okay, so there's a challenge in data collection. Infrastructure that holds and can then in pillar 4 analyze and derive actionable knowledge from the data. Okay, so I'm borrowing this vision because I think it's a good foundation for what lots of us are doing in the space. So coming to this idea of convergence of needs and opportunities, you see, I put P4 at the center of this system of enablers where things are happening in each of these 4 areas. For example, if you take personal self-monitoring devices, one thing that we observe is that predictive models that they used to require medical grade devices are now enabled by training using data that comes from consumer grade devices, and that's a quantum leap, right? So we don't have to have expensive sensors to generate data that is useful enough and noise free enough to tell something about ourselves. That's a quantum leap because it enables population-wide self-monitoring, and with that, huge training sets. But we'll see that is actually not always true. The second is data engineering. So there's a big gap between some of the data that we have access to, which is important data about our health, for example, health records, and this data is operational, meaning that it's used in hospitals, for example, but it's not research ready. So bridging the gap between operational data and making it research ready is one of the major challenges. There's another aspect having to do with scalability, but maybe I'll talk about that later with the size of the data. Okay, so but before you can do any data science, you have to do your data engineering right. So that's the message. The third is the myth that bigger data is better. And there's generally a dilemma in reality in here, because bigger data, it's either very expensive and unaffordable, or it's not expensive, but probably not very good quality. So for low price, you can buy lots of to a problem of curation, integration, and so forth. On the other hand, you can have accurate studies that collect lots of data, but it's focused and it's expensive. Has to look at your data for research purposes. For example, the NHS in England works by an opt-in by default model, where you consent to that it will not leak your data out. So these trusted research environments are pieces of infrastructure that are critical to engendering trust between the clinical research community and the people who actually emanate all this data and that provide this data cloud for research purposes. So I think you get the idea of the complexity of the landscape. If we can get all these things right, then what you get is a virtuous loop that starts with data collection, monitoring, critical testing, and then you engineer the data, as we said. We then finally professionals, and based on which you can devise interventions. And then the way to close the loop is to actually monitor the effect of these interventions. So this is a long-term, and then basically that's new data collection and so forth. So that's a long-term proposition. It's not just a cross-sectionally, you have to have good data, but you have to keep monitoring. And only if you do all of these things right, then you have some hope to actually cracking the data-driven medicine problem. Right. So underpinning all of this is, as I said, a complex, multifaceted landscape. So I try to summarize in this slide that has 5 quick questions that any technologist and practitioner should answer before they get into this game. Which data types are you going to look at? There's quite a few of those. Maybe I can anticipate. Yeah, you go, and then I come back to that. So we like to use primary care records and secondary care records, which are basically records that come directly from your doctor visits, including all your medicine prescriptions, or from hospital admissions, operations, things that I've done to you. Okay, but then there's omics data. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the progression of complexity of omics data, which goes from genotypes, which is the good old school way of sequencing a few genes. What you're looking for, but then it's kind of being over replaced, shall we say, by high throughput sequencing that generates whole exomes, which are basically 1 to 2% of your genome, and then finally whole genomes. And then it's not just the genomes, which is what stays the same in your life, but it's also your gene expression with all the streams that come from the wearable devices. And finally, the social demographics, so where you live and how your environment influences who you are. Okay, so let's go back to the other the other questions. Where do the datasets come from? And here I make a key distinction between retrospective and prospective studies, as we'll see, and then again, how much does it cost to acquire this data, which is linked to where they come from. And again, you have a cost in acquisition, but often neglected is the cost of curation, the cost of data engineering. And as we know in data science, 80% of the work is engineering, preparing the data. But oddly enough, this seems to be an overlooked cost in many cases. How large is the data? We'll see that big health data is often an illusion. It's big nominally, but then when you squeeze value out of it, you're left with some very little data. And finally, the governance of protection, as I mentioned earlier. So now, if you answer all these questions, then you get into the data science and engineering with your head in the right mindset. You know that you basically occupying one particular region of this complex space. And so the data engineering that you're going to do, the data science you're going to do, is focused on that region. So there is no universal data science for health. There's many solutions that apply in many different regions of this universe. Finally, to achieve some benefits to patients. Okay. So I talked about which data. Let's dive a second into primary and secondary care records. One data set that we use as a reference data set is the Biobank in the UK. Some of you may be familiar. This is a great biobank. It's got 500,000 people, half of which have linked records of the medical history up to 20 years of those. So this kind of the data that we can look at. It is one of the largest. I think it's one of the most authoritative in the world. In fact, is available to researchers all over the world, not just the UK. So basically, I have hundreds of millions of records of elementary GP events and tens of millions of records of prescriptions, plus hospital, plus in fact genomics, as we'll see. Okay. We'll come back to that in a second. Moving on to prospective, retrospective data sets. So there are pros and stable and predictable. It follows a protocol. We know how data is collected, and that's a foundation to build quality and trust. Okay, it's also research ready. It costs much more to collect than data that you find in hospitals, for example, but it's close to your research needs already. So validated and typically well curated and complete. What is important, and there will be a bias in this data set, but you know what the bias is, okay? Which is a big advantage because you want to be aware of the bias before you do any modeling. Examples are the biobank, and there's also geographic and social bias. As long as your research is happy with it, then you know how to deal with the bias, then you can do research with it. CPRD is another example. Is much bigger. It's got 60 million patients. But basically, it collects data from the GP practices. It doesn't have a cross-sectional baseline like the biobank does. Okay, these are the prominent ones in the UK, but there are many others. Retrospective data sets are typically operational data that you collect, that you harvest, from, for example, GP surgeries. The problem is that they have expressed a natural bias, which is typically, reflective of where the data is collected. For example, in the northeast of England, where I live, where Newcastle is located, we have a strong bias for certain kind of diseases, which are actually linked to deprivation status, and the life expectancy in the northeast of England is lower than in the rest of the country. That tells you something about, if you try to do research with that data, then you should be aware of that. The other problem is that actually is not research ready. It's collected by doctors to keep notes. It's not collected by doctors to enable our research, and that makes a huge difference. Okay. Right, so a quick example of a project in the EU that I'm involved in is called Litmus, that has both of these data types. So this is about liver disease and tries to collect data across centers in Europe, as is shown in the picture here, about people who have liver inflammation and then worse. Okay, and what they did is basically had a retrospective study which collects from many cohorts opportunistically from hospitals, basically harvesting data that was available, and it's about 10,000 patients. Now we have a big completeness problem in this data set and a big data quality problem. I hope the PI doesn't mind me saying that. So there's lots of effort going into understanding how much of the data is actually usable. And then there's a prospective study, which the European Union paid for, actually, mostly to collect data through active recruitment. But that, after 3 years, has generated about 2,000 patients. Just to give you an idea, when people talk about big health data, I scratch my head and say, look, you have to understand that this, if you're talking about real people, this is the data we're working with. It's 12,000 people, out of which 10,000 needs curation. Okay? But if you have this, then you're in a position to play games with your experimental design, for example, and use both. For example, now I'm stepping away from this for a second, but imagine you have a question on exploring the relationship between the social deprivation and mortality, and the mortality rate in a population that has multiple long-term conditions. Okay, so you can have a complete set of multiple deprivation indicators available in the biobank, which is great. However, we also have access to a regional UK dataset, which is retrospective. We harvested from the hospitals. We now have about 50,000, so a quarter of. It's kind of the same ratio that we've seen a moment ago. Okay, and it's varying in quality, it's varying in everything. It's a big unknown. Okay, so what we're doing for that, using the UK Biobank for discovery and the regional dataset for validation. Discovery is based on a reliable dataset. We know everything about it, and we discover candidate associations. Now, if we use for the Northeastern dataset for validation, and we discover that the models don't really apply, then we know we have a problem. We have a biobank that covers the entire country, but in a way that doesn't seem to be effective when we actually apply to the problem in our region. Okay, so that's the best of both worlds if you can play this game. So third, and I'm going quickly here because there's lots to go through here, is the cost. Okay, and once again we have typically a dilemma on a retrospective data needs lots of cost after the acquisition. Prospective data, it's an upfront cost, but then essentially it's happy sailing from there. Okay. But there's also another dimension. So the cost is also determined by the type of data. So there's low-cost data, which is routinely collected clinical variables every time you go in and have blood test at the GP. That's essentially available already, all the way to high-cost data. Okay. So here's an example, and we're going back to the Litmus data set, the NAFLD. NAFLD is a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. for those of you who don't know. So we start with 10,000 people, as you can see in this Venn diagram. But as soon as we start counting the number of individuals for which specialist test was made, the numbers drop very quickly. So GWAS, which is basically trying to find single pair mutations on individual genes, we only have 2,000 of those, which is mostly the prospective study at this point. The microRNA and RNA sequencing that you then use to do proteomics, it's even smaller. Okay, so that begs the question: is it actually worth spending the data to acquire more of the specialist variables, or how much do I really need those variables? Okay, and here's another view of the same problem. Now where each bar is an individual variable that is measured in litmus, and the yellow ones are the specialized variables. And as you can see, those are very scarce. So the higher the bar, the better, okay, the more complete. As you can see, they drop down quite drastically because especially they cost money and it's not done much. So 80% plus missing on 7 out of 9 specialist variables. Actually 8 out of 9, not 7. Okay, what do we do with this problem? Well, that's a cost picture. Okay, now look at this picture. What we've done, and I'm a bit vague because we haven't really published on this yet, we're just about to publish, is that for one particular response, we modeled a classifier to try and predict the response that is at risk of NASH, which is inflammation. And we used the core variable first, the easy ones, and then added variables as we went along. Obviously, the ones that are missing from most people means that you have the training set that correspondingly goes smaller and smaller and smaller. But after doing that modeling, we discovered that actually the marginal benefit of adding these yellow variables is not that great. So now we have quantified essentially the cost-benefit trade-offs in having, well, quantified the benefit here on actually having access to these extra variables. It may very well be. Okay, so that was just an example. So here's a more theoretical problem for you, if you're so inclined. In pure machine learning, you have, let's say you have two versions of a training set. The first has a feature set 1, and then a long list of data points, so many records, but not many features. So it's And what we would like to do is make the best of both worlds by basically leveraging a model that we learn from training set 1 in order to improve on the model that we learn from training set 2. Because the training set 2 is much smaller, it has a lot less power. But can we leverage some of the results that we have from the first, so the long and thin, to say something interesting about the in the cost of data that determines how much you want to spend. Okay, typically the cost is low for data that is readily available, and that is readily available for people who actually don't have a problem. So the controls in a case control scenario, for example, when you do physical monitoring, everybody has got a Fitbit or some kind of smartwatch and measure and monitor their own fitness. But I'm not, fortunately for me, I'm not an interesting case. Right? If you want to monitor the cases, for example, we have a study where we use physical activity monitoring to do gait analysis to then predict something about people with Parkinson's disease. Okay, those data are much more scarce. They're not automatically acquired. Okay, so there's an inversion here that the higher the cost, the lower the abundance. And the consequence of that is that when you do classification in the machine learning sense, you end up with a class imbalance problem. And as I'm sure you all know, this is not good because class imbalance is it's an enemy of classifiers. I'll get to that if I have the time in a minute. So let me move on quickly to size. I'm not going to say much about size, except that, we know that genomics is big. It's actually the largest data set you can find around. And this chart is from 2015, believe it or not, a paper. But the projection is that genomics, and it is coming through, dwarfs every other type of scientific data plus YouTube, okay, including astronomy data, mostly because astronomy data, you can throw away most of it as soon as you acquire it. You acquire tons of it, but then you process it and you distill it down to something much more manageable, okay? That begs the question, so can I do the same for genomics, for example, okay? Now, it depends. So for genomics, the answer is no. Okay, so let me step back a second. What is the size of a piece of data? Well, I'm sorry, a data set. It's the number of data points, obviously, times the size of each data point. And so the question is, can I reduce the number of data points if I cannot reduce the data point size? Okay, so how much information do I lose if I downsample and throw away information? With genomics, I would argue that you cannot throw away anything, because if you are an exome is basically the content of your genes. There is the minimal viable set of genomics that you can collect to say something about rare genetic diseases, for example. One single bit or base pair on that long string can mean risk of life for individual. One single bit generally is tens or hundreds, but certainly not billions. So unless you know, unless you look at all of these, you will not know whether you have some genetic disease. Okay, no downsampling. In other areas, you can afford to do that. Medical imaging, you can reduce the resolution. Sensor data, you can reduce the resolution. However, if you do representation learning, for example, because you're doing deep network, then you know that your input is a raw image and the raw time series. No downsampling here. I mean, you can reduce the levels to the occurrence of type 2 diabetes in the biobank. And this chart summarizes the point that I'm trying to make, that you think you have good data and big data, but once you squeeze the value out of it, you're not left with much in some cases. So big data can be an illusion sometimes. So you start from, okay, you have 500,000 participants, great. And then you discover that the ones that actually have accelerometry data associated is only a fifth of those, 100,000. Great, it's a great training set. Then you look for the cases. How many of those in the biobank have type 2 diabetes? Well, filter, you end up with 3,000 people, okay? So that is not what you expected. You started from 500,000 and you ended up with a positive training set of 3,000. On the other side, you have non-diabetes, 100 to diabetes, which means that you have to rule them out. Otherwise, they pollute our training set. In order to do that, we need EHR data, and that reduces down to 20,000. The ones out of these that have no impairments or we can use, and actually 8,000. So now you have from 500,000 people, we down to 3,000 positives. That's to make the case for data is sometimes an illusion. I'm going to skip the governance issue for lack of time here and move on to some data engineering requirements that come out of this discussion, hopefully. So here's some examples of two there, and again you can look at the papers. And then two retrospective studies based on severe pneumonia and so forth, right? So here's a summary of the issues that require data engineering, and we can't emphasize enough how much time it takes to address all this. So you can read this. We talked about data imbalance a little bit, sparsity and scarcity. There's irregular collection time series. You can't always do imputation. I would like to dwell a bit of instability for a second. And more importantly, the other two on the right, I'll touch upon, okay? So now there is basically all this web represents, these are the three studies. The first one with the COVID, with the HIV, and the other two with the COVID. Oh, these are documented in the papers that I referenced. But essentially, the lessons learned are that imbalance is very common in medical data sets, is the norm. So there are typically two mitigation that you can do. And again, I'm probably talking about things that you all know. You can either downsample. If you downsample the majority class, then you lose training samples. And again, you can do 3,000, 8,000. In that case, what we did is downsample the 8,000 controls, and because there were more than enough. Okay, but the other thing you can do is upsample the minority class, and you can use statistical approaches like SMOTI algorithm. Fantastic. That the statistical approach applies to tabular data, the multidimensional data that is described with a vector of features. In one of our studies, we were modeling a stochastic process using hidden Markov models, and that doesn't work. So you have to come up with something new to account for the fact that some of the states that you want to predict in your Markov model are infrequent, rare states. So mercifully, in this data set, intubation states and death were relatively rare compared to the majority. But guess what? These are exactly the ones that we want to predict again. So in the paper that I referenced above, we have proposed an ensemble techniques, an ensemble of HMM that is fairly novel, and it aims is to mitigate this imbalance problem. Okay. Just to give you an idea, the data engineering is not just opening the textbook and says, what do I do now? Upsample, downsample. Sometimes that doesn't work. You have to be smarter, if I may say so, than that. Okay. So I mentioned instability, and this is an interesting one, which is often overlooked, because in retrospective studies, data is not just irregular, but is unstable over time. In the case of the COVID data, it was a crisis mode where there was a tension between the doctors that wanted to do testing on patients and the testing lab. This particular test, like interleukin 6 here, which they had no idea they needed, and they asked the labs to do that. Fantastic. So not only the data changes from day to day, but the schema changes from week to week, which is a nightmare if you want to try modeling, because you keep retraining, and is also bad for instability for lots of other reasons. Okay. So I'm going a bit fast on this, but we're limited on time. But this is very easy concepts that you're probably familiar with. This has got to do with you can't assume that false positives or false negative have the same cost. Of being safe, the way you do as a technologist, as a machine learning expert or data scientist, you introduce cost-sensitive learning into your model, which means you tweak your loss function to bias for the minority class in such a way that you privilege false negatives relative to false positive. Again, I have a few references there for those of you that are interested. And finally, in this set, human in the loop AI. Again, there's like a comforting feeling that we now, the data science community has developed these explanation models, like sharp values, for example, listed on the left-hand side here. Making interpretable ML and so forth. But guess what? The doctors are not particularly happy with it because but they want to be involved in the decision process. They want to be able to validate the prediction and says, look, you got this wrong, you got this right, and I can tell you that this ranking of the variables that you propose to me doesn't make any clinical sense. Go back. So this human in the loop AI is only in its beginning, and there's no maturity there. So that's an open area. Causal machine learning is with the references on the next page is a good part here, because in publicly funded research in the UK, at least, I think, okay, there's a flickering a bit. Without that, you'd actually don't get a new grant. Okay, these are references. Very quickly, I have a few minutes left. I would like to touch upon something specific to electronic health records. There's basically two camps here. One is traditional statistics. This is what clinical researchers have always done. There's a wonderful systematic review. Again, please check out reference 1 here, which is fairly recent. That looks at how the problem of discovering patterns of multi-omic conditions has been addressed using traditional statistical methods and borderline machine learning methods, and by which I include clustering, for example. Now, clustering is great, unsupervised learning. The problem is that clustering diseases and even clustering patients requires an underpinning measure of proximity. And there's no agreement whatsoever on what constitutes proximity between two patients or two diseases. It's all up for grabs. So there's a constellation of works, none of which actually has reached full maturity, in my view, in this area. And then there's all the usual suspects here of the other methods that you can see. Again, I have lots of references for you to take home. More interestingly, perhaps, there's a very interesting survey, which is 2020, so you can't do much better than that. I put target outcomes on the left-hand side, which are all ambitious. For example, predict the future disease given your medical history, and you can see and you read the rest, but you can see that this calls for attention-based deep neural networks for the most part. And so on the right, I listed some of the 4 tools that the authors of Solares et al. Thought they were the prominent at that time. So that's probably still true today. And in that paper, they actually compared and contrasted the performance of those 4 methods on benchmark EHR datasets. So it's very good. So they achieve good results on each of the outcomes. So it's kind of coming to maturity. But again, the problem is to get the EHR data in the right shape in the first place. For example, regularize irregular EHR data. Okay, these are the references. I just wanted to use the last 5 minutes, if I may, to talk about something that we've been working on, we're still working on at the moment. And it goes in, it's in the same landscape of trying to predict the trajectory of patients who are each step during their medical journey. Let me see if I can express this. Okay, I'm gonna go to our goal. Instead of trying to anticipate and predict what is the next disease that's going to happen to you, which we find is too ambitious. We try to predict which of one of few clusters you're going to fall into as you progress. That's easier to predict. We think more realistic. If the clusters are small enough and cohesive enough in terms of the type of, for example, there's a metabolic cluster, there's a skin problem cluster, the drop into in the rest of your life based on a clustering model that is based on a large population, then you have a good predictive model that is also realistic in our view. Okay, let me see. What we hope to find, I'm skipping things because I'm conscious of time. We want to find that patients are actually stable relative to this clustering. What it means to be stable, it means that you have a cluster. At the beginning of your life, you're not going into a particular direction. Maybe you have something mild, maybe hypertension, which is very common, osteoarthritis if you're old enough, but there's nothing terrible, and it doesn't pull you strongly into a cluster. Now, as you move along, you are now attracted to one of the actually predict what's going to happen to you. Okay, so we use topic modeling, LDA, basically to do this cluster analysis. There's a form of semantic clustering that describes the clusters in terms of the disease terms themselves, which makes it easy for clinical experts, professionals, to validate these clusters and tell you, yes, this is a metabolic syndrome kind of cluster. This is a skin disease kind of cluster. Okay, if we do this, clinicians are happy from their side. If we can prove that a substantial percentage of our patients in our population are actually attracted to one of the clusters strongly more than the other clusters early in life, then that's a big win for us. Okay, so here's some examples of some of the progressions that we have observed. For example, patient 1 starts with osteoarthritis, and then progressively this attracted, this is like weights, let's say the gravitational pull to one of the topics, topic 1 relative to the others. And you can see that each event reinforces this pull towards topic 1. So this is a case where patient 1 is fairly stable and we can predict what's happening to them. Patient 2 oscillates a lot more. Let's say patient 5 is also quite stable. At some point, after a while, there's a competition between topics. Topics are obviously there will be overlaps, and it will be attracted by all of these topics at any given time, but more by one than by others. So that's kind of the game we're playing with this. Okay. Okay, so that was just like a really quick insight into a piece of work that is still ongoing. I think I used this already. But I wanted to conclude, actually, let me skip this. This is about synthetic data generation. We feel that's important, and it's an emerging topic in data-driven medicine, exactly because the minority classes, the cases are always lacking in the power, predictive power, and we want to have ways to amplify the minority class in a way that is clinically acceptable. Okay, and that's a challenge technically for data scientists. The challenge because really involves generating data using synthetic data using generative methods like GANs, for example. Okay, so let me conclude, summarize and conclude the key messages that I'd like to leave you with here, and then I'll be happy to take questions. There's great opportunities here in impactful research, but there's I hope I've convinced you very quickly in this quick talk that there are many challenges. And the challenges are more in the data rather than in the model. There's a need for integration, curation, and engineering. And the good news is there's lots of investment. There's investment in the UK, There are investment in the US, and hopefully in your country as well. I'm referring to India. I know this is this is a global conference, but I'm referring to the host country of the conference. And so there's mental problem, physical problems, and they all pertain to a population that is aging. So it is a global problem of demographics, and there's a need for global investments. So I think I'd like to stop here. I think that and the question is, how do you handle multi-periodic classification data sets in COVID? Well, the concerns are that every time you upsample, you introduce artificial data. And this is a statistically accepted way of doing that. This multi-algorithm for feature vectors has been around, so multi-dimensional data has been around for about 15 years. In fact, they just published a paper that says 15 years of multi, great success, which, if you're interested in this, I'll invite you to read it because it probably answers your question. Essentially, the problem is not to overdo it. I've seen publications where multi has been used so aggressively that you double in size your minority class, and by doing that, you basically create completely a fictional data set where the properties of you basically suddenly covering all the features of the space by magic, but it's not real. Okay, so the concern is that people don't know what they're doing when they're doing this, essentially. So in the case of HIV, that is a prospective data set, we have much more control. With in the controls, and be left with a different problem, which is how to make the best of a small training set. So rather than upsampling, you try to learn with fewer samples, and that is a machine learning problem that textbooks will tell you. I hope I have answered the question. I'm not sure there are other questions, but I can now see what's going on.
So are there any more questions? So thank you very much, Professor Missier, for your informative talk. And I was just wondering that sometimes in some of the slides you said that 2 feature sets you may have taken. So I was wondering whether the new features that have been, that have come up, you have said that new clinical tests were introduced. Yeah. So the specialized feature set may contain those data that you are suggesting.
Yes.
And the okay, and the F1 feature set that may contain the other demographics and other things. I mean, the age-old data that prescriptions they write about.
So so the distinction is typically made between the data, the features. So features that can be unavailable for 1 or 2 reasons. One is that the doctor didn't think it was a good idea to do the test at the time, and then it's too late. Basically, the correlation between the test and that particular moment in the diagnosis is gone. You cannot recover from that, essentially, and you have a lack of values where you would like to have, for example, this interleukin-6 is a marker that was introduced into the testing for COVID months after initial testing. So you cannot compare patients before and after. They're just not comparable, and it's too late to go back to the patients. It's not retrievable. Right? In other cases, you have a biobank, and you have a sample of the UK biobank has still a sample of my blood somewhere in some fridge, something. And if they want, they can go back and say, "Oh, let's do this now." Okay, so you can decide more and acquire more data. So these two are completely different situations. The question is that it's actually worth acquiring new data. And, in some cases, the marginal benefit of modeling with specialist data variables that come from proteomics, for example, is not that great. In fact, the push is for doctors to try and identify the minimal set of biomarkers that you can acquire cheaply, like in a screening situation, that gives you acceptable predictive power. I'm actually happy to aware that in your country you have a Paolo network that is trying to do exactly this. So it's trying to come up with a minimal set of variables of markers that are sufficiently predictive of a number of chronic diseases, of actually as a risk factor. Predictable risk scoring of type of patient.
Okay.
If
So
that
I
not-
think, yes, Ms.
No, I'm saying
Yes.
that generally means to think that everything was clear, everything is very confused. You tell me which one it is, Either way, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you.
In that sense, you are getting UK Biobank data, but maybe not in all countries we will be getting those government data. Okay. So I think that since there are no more questions, I assume, so let us thank Professor Missier for the great talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And again, apologies for not being there in person. There have been some glitches and hiccups, and we couldn't do anything about it. But I hope this was like an okay surrogate. And all the best for the rest of the conference.
Thank you, sir.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Please.